welcome to the Hero Report podcast. My name is Ari Cohen. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Nebraska, and with me, as always, on a slight tape delay, Matt Langdon of the Hero Construction Company. How are you, Matt?
I'm well. It's not so much tape delay as it is in and out, I think, in and out internet connections, so we'll see how we go. I'm very pleased that we have Elizabeth Svoboda on the show today. I met Elizabeth a little over 2 years ago when she came to my attempted hero camp and asked me questions about what I was doing there. A lot of questions I had no idea of the answer to myself at the time. And she has just released a book that's, I guess, at least 2 years in the making, What Makes a Hero, and that kind of overqualifies her to be on the show. So, Elizabeth, maybe you could start off telling everyone how this book came about, what got you started, and what that process was like.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, as you say, it was a number of years in the making. I'd done some reading over the years about people like Holocaust rescuers and people who were in similar situations where they really put a lot on the line to help somebody else out, and it really kept raising the question in my mind, why do some people provide this kind of help and not others? And then, maybe on a smaller scale, why do some people do a lot of volunteer work and really dedicate themselves to that, whereas other people are just looking out for themselves, more or less? So these questions were sort of tumbling around in my mind, and around, I guess it was about 2009 or so, I heard about a couple of research ventures that were getting started here in the Bay Area of California. One was at Stanford, the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education. There was some buzz about how they were inviting the Dalai Lama to campus to have a dialogue with some of their scientists there. And at around the same time, the psychologist Phil Zimbardo was getting started with his Heroic Imagination project with the goal of not only doing heroism research, but also kind of helping ordinary people to uncover their heroic side. So it all kind of meshed together in a way, and the timing was good, and I started to wonder, maybe there would be enough here for a book about the origins of selflessness, and then how can we apply some of this new science that's starting to come out in order to become more generous or even more heroic in our lives.
Yeah, and the book is divided into practice and theory, which I think is a great way to set it out. And one of the things that caught me, and I think is something that our viewers are used to us debating, is the difference or not of altruism and heroism. And you've got a great line from Phil Zimbardo that I think you really liked and used a lot in the book. Can you tell us what that is?
I think you're probably referring to when he told me, I think it said, there's a line at the upper limits of altruism where it ascends into heroism. And I think that certainly that's true, and I like the broader definition of heroism that sort of implies, that people who really are these dedicated altruists should be considered heroic in their own way. I mean, let's face it, we're not all going to have the opportunity to fish somebody out of an icy lake or rescue somebody from in front of a train, or the very traditional heroic deeds of that nature, but we all have opportunities in our own lives to help people, just on a basis Phil likes to call it being an everyday hero, just performing these selfless actions on an everyday basis, and then little by little that can add up to really what is a heroic life, even if there aren't any newspaper headlining heroic deeds that everybody knows about.
Yeah, what kind of feedback or varying feedback did you get when you told people that this is what you were working on? What were the reactions you got to the idea of heroism, or studying heroism, or writing about the study of heroism?
Right. That's an interesting question. I mean, a lot of people would say to me, actually, when I told them, I'm writing this book about altruism and heroism, that they would come back with, well, you know that there's no such thing as true altruism, right? Because if you're doing something good for somebody else, at least by appearances, chances are that you are getting something in return, whether it's that you are just getting sort of this warm glow feeling where you feel good about yourself, or maybe you think you're going to get some kind of improved social standing, as for instance, if you donate to the ballet, they're going to print your name in the program, everybody's going to see that. So yeah, I mean, certainly in a lot of cases where people behave altruistically or maybe even heroically, there is something in it for them. But I would respond, it doesn't really matter to me whether there's any such thing as true altruism, because as long as the good thing is getting done, as long as the heroic deed is being performed, and I think sometimes it can even be a good thing if you're getting something in return, because it's going to encourage you to come back and do more deeds like that and spread more good throughout the world. So I kind of would try to encourage them to look at it in a different way.
It is interesting.
Yeah, I would.
Oh, there's our delay right there. It is interesting the way people are sort of obsessed with this idea of a kind of purity. Something's not good unless it's unless there's absolutely no ulterior motive, or there's no way you could possibly benefit from having done a good thing. I found the same thing when I was talking to people about the book that I've been working on about heroism. Anytime
it sounds great, by the way. I was reading a little bit about it. I'm excited to read it.
Thanks so much. But people said the same thing, right? First, there are two kinds of people. People who say to you, "Oh, well, what about this example, right? Isn't this a good example?" And then there are people who say, "Ah, well, but I'm going to pick apart, whatever it is that you think is good, because it's not pure enough." And I sort of wonder, why do you think people do that?
I think some people maybe just have a very cynical view of the world, where they see everybody else as operators who are really at bottom just in it for themselves. And I think that can be a legitimate perspective to have, but I prefer to see it as, we do have kind of these natural inclinations to help others out as well. It's not all of one or all of the other. So for me, it's better to focus on the inclinations that we have to reach out to other people and hopefully do whatever we can to nurture those. But that said, yeah, I think there are always going to be those people who are not inclined to see things that way, and will try to tear down any sort of selfless effort, or just kind of look askance at it.
Yeah, I also have the sense that it makes it might make those people feel a bit better about their own choices, right? If this person isn't so pure, right, then they're not worthy of this kind of celebration, right? Sure, they did a good thing, but they had some reason for doing it. And so my not doing anything, or not doing particularly notable things, not a big deal, because nobody's perfect, right? Even these people who are doing good things, nobody's perfect.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, that rationalization does come into play. But I think it's kind of unfortunate, because nobody is perfect. And sometimes when you focus on, the imperfections, or, people's motives, or things like that, you lose sight of the great things that they actually are doing. I mean, if we look at heroes in popular culture, very few of them are perfect. You can always find something to poke a hole in about somebody else's life story, but to me, that's not sufficient license to write off all the good things that they've done. So we have to keep it in perspective.
Right.
What's the reaction been now that the book's out? I've seen a few articles that you've written online, and listened to you on a radio show last week, I think it was. Are you getting buzz from the book? Or?
Yeah, I mean, my publicist has been great. I don't really know the first thing about where to start from that side of things. So yeah, I mean, she's been able to help me get some wonderful press coverage, and hopefully get the message about the book out there to people who otherwise might not have seen it. And yeah, I've gotten some great feedback, some really encouraging messages from people. And as you know, being an author is not a particularly lucrative profession, so most of us get into it for other reasons. And knowing that you've kind of succeeded in getting inside somebody's head and maybe changing the way that they look about certain things, to me that's very fulfilling, or just getting them to think twice about maybe an assumption that they might always have made. So it's been great. But that said, we're just a couple weeks into it. The book just launched very recently, so I'm sure I'll be getting more feedback, good and bad.
One of the I'm trying to look for visual cues here on whether Ari's going to say anything, but audio and video are separate at the moment and delayed. So it's
here's what I'll do from now on. If I'm not going to say anything, put my head to the side like this.
Yeah, it's got to be the Friday the 13th.
So one of the one of the things, one of your chapters was on the notion of suffering and how it's linked to heroism, and I think you and Ari could maybe have a little conversation here, because your take on it was that suffering kind of prepares you for heroism, and Ari, certainly one of his heroic archetypes is the suffering hero. So if you could maybe give us an overview of the idea of suffering preparing us, we can maybe riff off that for a little bit.
Right. Yeah, there's actually a psychologist named Irvin Staub, who's probably one of the best-known researchers in this area, and he likes to talk about this concept that he calls altruism born of suffering, or ABS, I think is how he abbreviates it in the papers. But the basic idea is that when we've experienced something difficult ourselves, whether maybe we've gone through a natural disaster or experience some kind of interpersonal violence, if we've had that kind of tough experience, we know exactly how bad it feels to somebody else when they're going through the same thing. And in some cases, that might motivate us, make us more inclined to be helpful when we see somebody else who's in that kind of situation. And Staub actually did a study a few years ago with one of his colleagues where people who had experienced certain types of difficulties in their past, I think, the natural disaster and the violence were two of the ones that he looked at. People who had gone through that were more likely to say that they wanted to give money to victims of the Asian tsunami. So it's something where, yeah, if you look at these predictive suffering experiences, it can make us more inclined to reach out to others, because we know how bad it is what we're going through, and we want to take that burden off of them. Whereas if we had just gone around being happy 100% of the time, we kind of wouldn't even have a conception of what it was like to go through something like that.
This is actually how I got interested in doing research on the topic of heroism to begin with, we sort of had a commonality when you mentioned Holocaust rescuers being kind of the way that you sort of entered into this. It was the same for me, and so the interesting thing is I want to maybe pull back from just the experience of suffering, and maybe say that there is something like what I refer to as personal identification, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be that I have an experience of suffering, though I think certainly that is one of the easier ways to personally identify with people who are suffering, is to have suffered yourself, especially in a similar way. But simply a kind of personal identification with that sufferer, right? Not necessarily with the suffering. So this is what you see in a lot of the Holocaust rescuer literature, right? Not necessarily that a person says, oh, I've had this experience of being under assault or something like that, but, I'm also a parent of young children, right? And here in front of me is a mother with young children who needs assistance, right? If it was a grandparent or something, I might not have acted, but It's someone who's just like me, right? In a way that's very
Yeah.
immediate.
Right.
So it's interesting, right? I mean, I think that there is this. There's certainly I think an agreement that here between you and I about this kind of personal identification. I think suffering is one way that people who act altruistically are more likely to identify with someone else who's a prospective or current victim.
Right. Yeah, I think I agree with that. Yeah, that suffering is one way that we can get to this place of identification, but by no means do I think it's the only way. And also, it's not necessarily that everybody that suffers ends up having this perspective. For some people, suffering, that whole experience maybe can make them shut down, can make them turn bitter, and actually be less likely to reach out to others. So there's definitely an element of personal choice in how we respond to the suffering as well, and I think that's important to talk about too. But yeah, this idea that what's most important is thinking about what you have in common with somebody else and finding that point of identification, whether it's because you went through similar suffering or for some other reason. And it could even be something really basic, like that you're fans of the same sports team, and even if on the surface you don't appear to have much in common with that other person, if you find one of these commonalities. There was an experiment that I heard about last year at the Science of Compassion conference in Colorado, that if you were tapping hands in time with somebody else in an experiment, you were actually more likely to help that person who you were tapping in time with later on when they had to carry out this annoying task involving a lot of math problems. So yeah, it can be something as basic as that you're tapping in time with somebody else that helps you to come to that point of identification and then maybe reach out to help them later on. So yeah, I think a lot of our efforts should be concentrated on finding what is that point, how can I empathize with this other person.
Right, it's about building that connection, right?
Yeah.
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 Okay, you two keep talking. I just realized my computer's not plugged in. I'll be back in less than 1 minute.
Okay, sounds good.
I think that idea of, I think the idea of finding or having that connection, that something in common with someone, is clearly important in heroism. But I wonder, in today's society, it seems, I mean, you could argue that we're getting less and less connected with each other, but I think there's also a case of people really identifying strongly within one group, especially in the US with right-wing and left-wing. There's this really strong connection, but there's also this disconnect as well. What can we do? Did you see anything in your research with suggestions on how individuals can start getting those connections and understanding or thinking about what their commonalities are?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of ways to approach this. Of course, this is not an easy question. There's one study that I love by the political scientist Kristen Monroe, and she looked at different categories of people during World War II. Like, she looked at rescuers, she looked at bystanders, and she looked at perpetrators, and she tried to look for characteristics. Okay, what distinguishes the rescuers from the bystanders, or the people who didn't do anything? Is there something about the way they looked at the world that sets them apart? And one of the things was that these people tended to have a mindset that they really saw all of humanity as this common body. They didn't see themselves so much as, I'm just a member of this group, or I'm just a member of this religion, these very exclusive groups. They really saw things in a much broader way, so that if they were to meet somebody who doesn't necessarily have ethnic origins in common, or religions in common, or even political perspective, that they would still see themselves as obligated to help that person and serve that person, because of this view that they had of the world as sort of a big extended family. So that, I think, is a very good place to start, for us to just start to enlarge our ideas of who do we consider part of our tribe, and is it possible that we can expand those notions so that our tribe is actually more so the entire planet?
It's funny. That is, it's almost word for word what the philosopher Richard Rorty has written about, right?
I haven't read Rorty, so I can't.
You ought to. You ought to. It's very much along these lines, right? He writes about he's following the philosopher David Hume and talking about a progress of sentiments, right? So expanding the sense of who counts as part of we. Yeah, who we are, and this is the kind of moral progress that he talks about as being a sort of worthy project for philosophers in the 20th, 21st century. It's yeah. Well, I highly recommend it to you.
Yes, I will definitely check that out. And yeah, it's interesting that these ideas that philosophers have been talking about for many years, not now some of the more specific research is starting to back them up and confirm that this is the direction that we should go.
Yeah. On that note of kind of identifying yourself as part of a bigger group, you had a chapter on meditation.
Yes.
Where did that? Can you talk about where that came from and what your conclusions were there?
Yeah, I actually participated in a new course that was being offered at Stanford last year. It was called Compassion Cultivation Training, and it had a very large component of meditation that was sort of based on the traditional Buddhist practice of Tonglen, which in very basic terms involves envisioning that you're breathing in somebody else's suffering, and you can concentrate on a specific person or on a larger group. And then as you breathe out, you envision sending them goodwill, sending them peace, sending them whatever they need to be at peace with themselves. So it's really a practice of focusing on other people's suffering. And one of the things that surprised me, I think, when I was participating in this was, hey, it's actually really, really hard to do this. It's hard to focus on other people's suffering. And so I think without intending it, we kind of tend to shut it out. Like if you have a friend who's, recently been diagnosed with cancer, gone through some difficult experience, like it can be difficult to know what to say with them and to be in the presence of that kind of misfortune. And sometimes, I think we kind of hold back and we don't want to engage with that. But I guess what participating in this class shows me is that it's important to kind of push through that and do engage with another person's suffering, because it's by trying to understand that suffering and understanding what they must be going through that I think gives us the motivation to try to help them. If there's any way that we can be of assistance as they're going through this trial, like, we've devoted mental energy to understanding their position, and so we're going to be more motivated then to step forward and do something about what they're facing.
Yeah, I think in mentioning that it's difficult, I think that goes for a lot of hero training. If you're someone who wants to be heroic in the future, it's not just a matter of deciding that that's what you're going to do. And that's something I've been sharing with kids all this calendar year, really, is that this isn't easy. It is going to take some effort from you. And it's going to be uncomfortable. You might get embarrassed. I think that might be a good transition maybe for you to explain, if someone wanted to be a hero, what would your best advice right now be as considering the second half of the book?
Right. Yeah, I mean, just to address this question of it being difficult, I mean, yeah, I think it's very important to be honest, especially with audiences of kids, about that up front, that, yeah, I mean, if you stand up for somebody who's being bullied, it's possible that you might get bullied yourself as a result, and we can't, discount that. And I think Phil Zimbardo has told me that sometimes people ask him, could it be dangerous trying to teach kids to be heroes? Might they get themselves into situations where where they're in over their head. So I think, a very important part of heroic training is to have people, learn to use judgment as to whether it makes sense or whether it's foolhardy to intervene in a given situation, but also to be aware that they could face personal consequences as a result of getting involved, and kind of, that they have to be okay with that. And not everybody is going to step forward to be a hero. It has to be something that you're really committed to. And Matt, I remember when I observed one of your classes at the Hero Camp, we did some talking along the lines of the kids were coming up sort of with their own moral code or like certain principles that they wanted to live by. And I think there is evidence that when we have this kind of moral code, whether it comes from our own thinking, or whether it comes from an organization like the Navy or some other organization that we belong to, like when we've done some thinking about a code like that and kind of gone through on our mind, okay, what are we going to do if we find ourselves in a worst case scenario where we might have to put ourselves at risk in order to save somebody else? Would we be willing to do that? That when we thought that through in our minds, or possibly rehearsed it in some other way, like in a rescue training class, that we're going to be more likely to do that. So I think, it's really helpful to consider, what do I want my personal moral code to be, and what am I really willing to give up to uphold that if push comes to shove?
Yeah, I think something that stood out to me when I was looking at moral code or honor codes was Bushido that the samurai used, and the thing that really stuck out was that the idea was that Bushido would prepare you for anything. That in any situation, you'd know what to do, you'd know the right thing to do, and it wasn't just any sort of theoretically a situation that you might not have been in before, but potentially a situation that has never occurred before, and that it was a very helpful thing for them when the Europeans really came into Japan, and no one could have, the general population never predicted that could happen, and it was completely alien. But they knew what to do because they had this honor code, and I think that's an amazing consideration for people today. That's the power of an honor code.
Yes, and that's definitely the power of an honor code. And I think that situational training can be very important too when you're talking about particular heroic scenarios. I was doing some writing recently about Chesley Sullenberger, who's the U.S. Airways pilot that a few years back he was on a passenger flight and both of his engines got knocked out at almost the same time by a passing flock of birds. But he was somebody who had been a pilot for decades, and strangely enough, he also had experience flying engineless gliders. So I would speculate that kind of experience that he had would come into play, and he would be able to draw on that even though he hadn't faced this exact situation where he's flying a passenger aircraft and both his engines get knocked out at the same time. But yeah, that training does come into play in putting others ahead of yourself. Like I know that when he landed the plane on the Hudson River, and then he made sure that all the passengers got out before he was willing to leave the plane. And I'm sure that that's something that would have been ingrained in his training, that pilots, they learn to put other people ahead of themselves. And the more you practice that, and the more you get that code ingrained in the brain, I think the more likely you're going to be to uphold that code in a real life situation, even if it's a little bit surprising or not just like what you faced before.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it'd be a fascinating study to compare his training with the ship's captain. Was it the Costa Concordia, Matt? Is
right.
That because theoretically they both should have I'm talking about the sort of the second half, right? Not about the landing the plane, but getting people off, ensuring that everybody is all of your passengers are safe and accounted for.
Exactly.
It'd be a really interesting comparison between those two.
Right.
because one is such an utter failure.
Yeah.
That presumably they both, I mean, my presumption is they had similar training, but it would be interesting to find that they didn't.
Yeah, I'm not sure if anyone has looked into that specifically. I mean, I imagine with the Costa Concordia that there was investigation of that incident, and they may have found certain factors like that. But yeah, I would be very curious to know, and yeah, it would be interesting to look at a group of people who did really come forward and people agree that they behaved heroically, and then, you know, people who behaved in a cowardly fashion. Are there, you know, essential traits that distinguish them? Is that possible to untangle in some way so that we can learn from that?
Yeah, I start to gesture in this direction at the end of my book, where I look at two examples in Rwanda. And there's so much work that could be done here, and so many examples that you could pick. But you know, one of the things that I suggest as being pretty important in especially sort of really catastrophic situations, right? I mean, I'm looking at genocide there. Is this idea of sort of embracing your mortality, right? So in the examples that I've been looking at, the person who doesn't do the heroic or altruistic action is simply trading other people's lives for his or her own safety, right? It's a bargain where he says, maybe I can get a little bit more life. You know, I could live a little bit longer if I make this kind of bargain. In some cases, you know, really selling out presumably deeply held principles. The example I use is of a priest, right? Who one would think would be very committed, you know, to protecting the lives of the people in his church, but you know, who clearly is not, who is far more interested in protecting himself, his own life, than in sort of sticking to these principles that he holds.
Right.
But I'm sure there's more. I'm sure there are other factors. That's just the one that so obviously stands out.
Yeah, I mean, I think about a woman, a diarist during World War II. Her name was Etty Hillesum, and are you familiar with her at all? I mean, she wasn't what I would think of as a traditional Holocaust rescuer, but she was a Jewish woman who, because she was in a relative position of privilege, she was on the Jewish Council in Amsterdam, and she was able to travel, you know, like to and from the concentration camp Westerbork. She probably honestly could have gotten out. Like, she could have gone into hiding, but she had made up her mind that she was basically going to be there as a support for her people. She said, I think her words were, I want to be the thinking heart of the concentration camp. And so in order to do that, she had to be there, and she had to put her own life on the line, and she had to decide that something else, some larger good, was more important than her own life. And yeah, this is exactly the decision that, as you say, this priest was not able to make. And so why do some people make this decision and others not? And, you know, if any of us were in that situation, which way would we go? And I think it can be a very uncomfortable question, because, you know, I'm not sure. It's tough to know unless you're actually there.
Yeah, you know, it's funny you give this example. I'm not familiar with that particular story. The one that I use in my book is Janusz Korczak from the Warsaw Ghetto, right? It's a very, very similar story. And Korczak, of course, perishes with all of the children from his orphanage.
Such a sad story, yeah.
Terribly sad story, but he has numerous. I mean, he's famous. He's famous, and people would willingly smuggle him out of the ghetto, and he won't leave. And he takes the children, you know, to the rail cars, and even then he has the opportunity not to get on the car, not to get on the train car. I think, you know,
I'm sure you could have gotten people to intercede for him from outside, but from what I know, he didn't even try. He was like, I'm going to stay with my kids.
Yeah, he would not consider it. Because it would be worse for them. It would be much harder for them to face what was coming if he had left them. And I think that it's that sort of, as you say, these are the kinds of questions when I teach about heroism, I kind of pose that question to students, but it's a funny question because everybody says what you would expect them to say, right? That I hope that I would do I hope I would do that. I hope I would do the hard thing. It's hard to imagine oneself doing either the right thing or the wrong thing, right? Both, I think, are equally difficult to imagine for oneself.
Right, and I think sometimes it can be hard to condemn people, too, that don't necessarily do the heroic thing, because it really does require going above and beyond. Thinking about the Warsaw Ghetto, the head of the Jewish Council, Adam Czerniakow, who basically committed suicide when the Nazi leaders told him, you're going to be in charge of, we're going to oversee sending this many thousands of people to the camps per day. And, it was going to be women and children, it was going to be everybody. And, he couldn't stand the idea that he would have to preside over that. So, I think he just felt like he couldn't go on. And some people might view that as cowardly, but I don't know. Like, I think he was just in such a difficult situation, and he, at that time, did not see a way out. And it's very hard to say he should have done something else without having been there and without having facing what he faced. So, yeah, I think it's important to emphasize just what difficult decisions these can be.
Yeah, because what we're saying to people ultimately, we're saying, you ought to make the hard decision, which is very likely to result in someone killing you, right? In a lot of these situations. Embrace your murder, knowing that you're doing the right thing. Is a very, very difficult thing to say, right? In the case of this example in the Warsaw Ghetto, there is no good choice there, right? There's no, and that's the case for so many of these people. The Rwandan examples that I like to use are equally difficult, but some of them offer kind of these interesting possibilities, different possibilities, right? So the case that I've written most about is Paul Rusesabagina, who of course was in the Hotel Rwanda film, was made about his story, and that example, he simply keeps telling people they can't do what they intend to do. Right? And from talking to him, that's all he was committed to doing. But again, there's this mortality issue. He was sure they were going to kill him. He was absolutely sure they were going to kill him. And he said, I was simply committed to telling them no until such time as they decided they would kill me. And it turned out that he was a good bargainer, and he in particular had resources at his disposal that other people didn't have, and he made use of them. And I think that's most people didn't have those kinds of resources, but it is interesting to see that it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be killed, though in his case he felt sure that he would be.
I'm reminded of an interview that Chad Lindsay gave with Anderson Cooper. Chad Lindsay was a subway rescuer, and he's going to be at the conference, the Hero Roundtable, which we have taken a long time to mention in this episode.
Oh, yeah.
But so Chad was brought onto the show to talk about the famous 10 months ago incident on the subway where the photographer took a photo of the guy who died seconds later. And he said, so many people are quick to judge, but you just don't know unless you're in that situation. And I see that time and time again, and especially with that story, people just jumping on to criticize all the people that didn't do anything. But we know from fact, from statistics, that most people don't do something. Most people are bystanders in these situations, but they all, when it's at a long distance, they can all say you did the wrong thing. That's it's
Yeah.
fascinating.
I'm very good at that.
Oh yeah, I'm very good at that too. But yeah, I think we have to guard against that really carefully because yeah, we just don't know. And even if we make the decision to try to intervene heroically, we don't really know whether our efforts are going to be successful. Yeah, are we going to live? Are we going to die? Like there are just so many unknowns, and you have to be comfortable with those unknowns. I talk in my book about skydiving instructor Dave Hartsock, who basically he was doing a tandem dive with a first-time skydiver, and in midair they were having some parachute problems. The first chute didn't open properly, and then the backup chute kind of got tangled with the first parachute, and so they were falling to the ground at an extraordinary rate of speed. And under the pressure of the moment, Dave made this decision that I'm going to use my control toggles to rotate my body so that when Shirley, my student, and I hit the ground, I'm going to be underneath her, and hopefully that my body would be able to cushion her fall. But he didn't know whether that was going to work. He didn't have a whole lot of time to think through the particulars of what he was doing, but this was just the snap decision that he made, the selfless decision. And it turned out that he was able to protect her, even though that she sustained some injuries. She was able to recover and basically lead a normal life. But unfortunately, Dave was paralyzed over most of his body as a result of that decision he made. And I mean, the amazing thing to me, I got to meet him in person. I asked him, would you do the same thing again, in full knowledge of what could happen to you? And he said, absolutely. And I think he was just the person who took his student safety very seriously. That was his honor code, that he was going to put his student safety ahead of his own. And, he was able to uphold that. And, it was just awesome to be in the presence of that.
So we're getting very close to the end of the show here. Elizabeth, if someone's watching and they wanted to start preparing for heroism tomorrow, what would be the 3 suggestions you'd give them? What are the 3 things you can do to prepare to be a hero?
Right. Well, one great thing to try is to surround yourself maybe with heroic role models. When we look at these studies of rescuers, time and time again, we hear the rescuers saying, there was somebody in my life, whether it was a family member or somebody else, that really inspired me and made me believe that I could behave selflessly, I could have the selfless philosophy, and maybe even behave heroically too. So, it can be helpful to find somebody like that in your life, whether it's a family member or just some other kind of mentor who can encourage you along that path. That can be a great first step to take. Another thing that's easy for almost everybody, I think, to put into practice is just to take small opportunities to help other people around you, just with ordinary everyday things. And one of Phil Zimbardo's theories is that when we're carrying out this kind of other-oriented behavior, being pro-social is the scientific term for it, that then, if we ever find ourselves in a situation that calls for like a big-time heroism, then we're going to be oriented to other people's needs, and we're going to be able to step in. And then just to emphasize again, this thinking about what you have in common with other people. If you meet somebody, maybe they seem like a difficult person, or you have some kind of conflict with them, just trying to highlight what do you have in common with them rather than what separates you from them. That's going to be what's going to awaken your empathy for them, and hopefully, if they end up needing help in the future, inspire you to be the person that steps in to provide that help.
That's some pretty good advice there. Thank you very much for coming on the show, Elizabeth. Again, the book for everyone is What Makes a Hero: The Surprising Science of Selflessness, and you should get on Amazon and buy it and leave a review, right?
Yes, absolutely. I would love to read your reviews and hear from people about what you thought of the book. I look forward to having conversations with people.
And we'll make sure this is available for sale at the conference too. We'll have
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, I'll pack a suitcase of them.
Ari, do you want to close out the show, because that's what one of your many skills?
Oh yes, I'm famous for ending the shows. Well, I want to thank both of you. This has been an exciting Friday the 13th recording of the pod, though it will not go up on Friday the 13th. People will be able to watch it on Monday the 16th. So it should be free of any technical problems, because it won't be Friday the 13th anymore. But I'm glad that we made it through. This has been, I think, a really, really interesting conversation. Elizabeth, thanks so much for joining us. Matt, thank you. I'm glad that the lagging seems to have gotten better over time, or whatever has happened. Thanks, everyone, for watching, listening, and hopefully commenting when you hear or see this. We will be back again in relatively short order next week, and we'll continue, of course, to promote the Hero Roundtable Conference. So if you haven't found out about that, HeroRoundtable.com is your one-stop shop. Thank you all again, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks so much for having me. It was great.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
Okay. Bye-bye.